Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for coming to this, just sharing with us this incredible opportunity. When I invited our guest, I thought, well, maybe we have a little bit of a chance of luring her to Notre Dame to share her life and experiences and expertise with us in her art. And so I was absolutely just ecstatic that Margarethe von Trotta just automatically expressed enthusiasm for visiting a little university in northern Indiana. And I first saw one of Ms. von Trotta's films, and I didn't realize it until recently. In the late 1970s, your first film with Volker Schlondorf, The Lost Honor of Katharina Blum,
yes.
Which I recommend to all of you. It's a very, very powerful film that is unfortunately very relevant for our times. It's about a period in Germany in the 1970s when there's a lot of hysteria about terrorism, and an innocent woman is accused of being part of a crime, I don't remember what, falsely accused, and then she's persecuted by both the police and the press. And of course we live in times in which that the potential of that same hysteria is so great. For those of you who have seen her films, Margarethe von Trotta deals with issues of great intellectual content. They're very challenging films. They don't condescend to the viewer, and they deal in many, many cases with strong women who are controversial, facing tough times, tough challenges. They deal with deep issues like human dignity, human rights. But I think also the virtue of her films, and I hope I'm capturing this in the right way, is that they're very human films. In that they're essentially films about how we live with each other. They're films about human relationships and how we treat each other, how we conflict with each other, and how we hopefully survive with each other. So you came here, I could read about all of Margarethe's many, many films, but you came here to listen to her. And today, you're going to share with us your thoughts about your approach to biography, of course, where you are have tremendous expertise. So,
Thank you. Oh, you met the computer here. I don't need a computer. I'm still old-fashioned. No, he said that I was immediately enthusiastic to come here. I'm coming from Paris, so Notre Dame. So I wanted to know what's Notre Dame here. And then I informed myself, and no, it's not good. And everybody told me, oh, it's a very important university. So I think it's so, because now I'm here for the third day, and I must say it's all true. Okay. So, for the biography, it's just to tell you how I approach until I'm ready to shoot. So it's not about the film itself, it's just what road I have to go until I can shoot. So, after my film, Hannah Arendt, was released in Germany, I was invited by the Piper Verlag, that's the German publishers of nearly all of Arendt's writings, to write a book about Hannah Arendt. Since there are already so many books, biographies and texts about her, I was initially surprised by this offer. it seemed unnecessary to create yet another book. It was later explained to me that the intent was not a new biography. It was instead, but I should describe her specific sense of her as a woman and as a philosopher, and also to illuminate how I unlearned my fear of her. I rejected the offer because I wanted to end the matter with the film, and I was uncertain as to whether readers would be interested in my doubts or fears. My response disappointed the publisher. The editor who proposed it was, unlike me, convinced that people who liked the film would be curious to learn why I took on such a significant woman and philosopher, and whether my courage had occasionally abandoned me. I will attempt now for you to address belatedly what. You can understand me? I will attempt so belatedly this request, and I will describe the difficulties I had with my portrait of Hannah Arendt, not only with regard to my film about her, but also with regard to two other historical female figures, Hildegard von Bingen and Rosa Luxemburg. To that end, I would like to invoke a statement that Hannah Arendt made in an interview towards the end of her life. I would like to say that everything I did and everything I wrote, all that is tentative. I think all thinking has an earmark of being tentative. And in the same way, so it's everything that I can say in and about a film. What does it mean for a filmmaker to open herself up to a historical person? For without this mutual confrontation, without the attempt to find and to reflect oneself again in this figure, without working hard to triumph over the lack of familiarity, in order to arrive to some form of intimacy, there can be no participation on the part of subsequent viewers. Hannah Arendt is, as I said, not the only woman in my filmic life with whom I have tried to form an alliance. I certainly sensed from the very beginning that she would offer the most resistance to me. She was a woman who was in utter contrast to her American friend, the writer Mary McCarthy, extremely reserved about her private life, and who almost never revealed her emotions to strangers. And to probe a person solely from an intellectual perspective is not enough for me. There are films that develop entirely in their own. One sits down and begins to fantasize, and it is as if one pulls a zipper to one's very unconscious. And with that, of course, to one's own hidden life. That happened to me with my film Sisters, or Balance of Happiness. In it, I anticipated or intuited that I have a sister about whom I knew nothing until this time. So tomorrow you will see the following as the last film, the answer. And on the other hand, there are films, subjects or persons that are brought to one's attention from the outside. And that one does not at first want to believe could have anything in common with oneself. With these subjects, it takes a long time to develop a feel for the correspondences in the sense of Baudelaire's correspondence. The thought of making a film about Hannah Arendt did not originate with me. After I had finished Rosenstraße, Martin Liebel, a long time friend and promoter of my films, approached me quite forcefully with this idea. Filming for Rosenstraße had been very demanding, and I had intended to think about my next film in peace. My first reaction to his suggestion was, to shake my head and express complete incomprehension of his request. A film about a philosopher whose chief occupations were thinking and writing. Utterly impossible. That can be depicted in film. Hence, this topic was initially off the table for me. But after a while, I remembered that I had the same hasty reaction once before. Rainer Werner Fassbinder's last project had been a film about Rosa Luxemburg. And after his death, the producer suggested it might be an idea for me. He thought that I owed it to my friendship with Fassbinder to take over the film. And most of all, because I was a woman. This was the first time in the fall of '82 that I heard that this would be work to my advantage. But I turned it down. At that point, I knew only little about Rosa Luxemburg, although she was an icon of the '68 generation. We knew her through the image of her that students at that time had carried on signs through the streets, an image that appeared next to the heads of Marx, Lenin, and Ho Chi Minh. Between all these men, there was just this one woman. With that, I noticed that her face came across as especially sad, and not nearly as ready for struggle as I would have expected from a revolutionary. These contradictions made me curious. Perhaps that was a reason to finally concede to the pressure of the producer. Contradictions have always tempted me. Nevertheless, I imposed one condition, that I should write my own script, that is to say that I could find out for myself what it was about Rosa Luxemburg that I found personally compelling. What would get me in the mood for love. I often deal with history in my films, and I always try to establish a connection to my own biography. Rosa Luxemburg was a revolutionary. My mother and her family were, as Baltic aristocrats, expelled from Moscow through the same revolution to which Rosa was fervently attracted. They were stateless and homeless as a result. As a child, I always heard that the Bolsheviks were responsible for their misfortune, and some of them had even thanked Hitler as he began the war against Russia. My mother read the memoirs of Alexander Kerensky or Wolfgang Leomann's Child of Revolution, and other writers who had broken with communism. She read neither Marx nor Rosa Luxemburg. Suddenly, I saw in this offer to make a film about Rosa Luxemburg, and hence about a time that I had not personally experienced, the opportunity to understand something about my family history. Where did we come from, and what had this century made of us? It was to be a rocky road, intellectually, emotionally, and physically. In order to consult the unpublished text of Rosa Luxemburg, I had to make a pilgrimage to East Berlin, to the Institute of Marxism-Leninism. I had to take the S-Bahn up to the Friedrichstraße, stop every time. That East German police patrolled the platform, and the passport inspection I was ordered in a rude tone to listen up, and I never succeeded in eliciting even the meekest smile from the stubbornly serious-looking inspectors. Coming out of the Friedrichstraße station, I had to walk to the Karl-Liebknecht-Straße up to the corner of Pik Allee to the Institute. Many West German historians and scientists at that time were denied access, and it was only thanks to a misunderstanding that I was allowed in this temple of Marxism. The reason I had once innocently become a member of a West German peace movement, which, as I later learned, was financed by the German Democratic Republic. The censors thus assumed I was amicably disposed towards their state, and perhaps even a member of the German Communist Party. All the same, I was not allowed to take a single step alone. I was even accompanied into the smoking room, at this time I was still smoking, by a historian who had to act as if he were also addicted to cigarettes. Luckily, I was quickly got to know the Rosa Luxemburg experts there, Annelies Laschitzer, with whom I'm friends to this day. Even she, despite our friendship, had to make a report about me, as I gathered from the Gauck papers after the fall of the wall. She did so without denouncing me. She warned me even, though he was a party member, against seeking a co-production with the German Democratic Republic. They will only approve a film that puts her on a pedestal, just like our film about Clara Zetkin, she said, and I took her warnings seriously. This research, just like the work, it's moving. I was to do years later for my film Rosenstraße, became something like taking a history class in a subject I've never studied so thoroughly before. I traveled for weeks not only to East Berlin, but also to Warsaw, where Rosa Luxemburg was imprisoned at the beginning of the century. But the more I learned of and about Rosa Luxemburg, the more uncertain I became. A Polish colleague, a vehement anti-communist, like so many Polish people at that time, told me, leave her lying in the Landwehrkanal, where she found. Why do you want to dredge her up? In the biographies, written mostly by leftist historians, I found almost nothing about her private life. It was all about party and about the correct interpretation of Marxism and class struggle. There was no information about love or about her many friendships, particularly when these relationships were not strictly political. In reading these biographies, I had an experience similar to that of Rosa Luxemburg herself, who once lamented in a letter to Leo Jogoszis, her Polish lover and comrade, pages-long remarks about the work of the party, but not a crumb of a normal life. I was sometimes so tired that I almost fainted from your scribbles. When did we actually really live? Normal life. Where could I learn something about that? Luckily, Rosa left behind 2,500 letters. There I could learn what I wanted to know about her likes and her dislikes, her encounters with love, and her moments of doubt. And yet, in order to approach the hidden sides of her personality, I even sought refuge in the method of active imagination. Sigrid Jung described this process. One sits on the floor and closes their eyes and waits for a fantasy to arrive. I set out to meet Rosa in such a way that she would reveal things to me that I couldn't find in the book. In one of these sessions, just to give you an example of how that works, she told me I had very beautiful long hair, and whenever I was with a man, I spread it out over him. I use it then in the film. There are, after all, only photos of her with she wore the hair pinned up like all these women of the time. So you always had the feeling that that was her image and that she had long hair. You didn't imagine that. So that was good for her. While I searched for her, and not least in this adventurous way, I experienced an emotional roller coaster. If I read a letter of her to her friends, she appeared warm-hearted and lovely to me. If I read a speech that inveighed against her comrades and the party, She had the effect of being bossy and arrogant. Then I would take up her letters again and find her admirable. But after a while, her infatuation with plants and birds annoyed me, and I would have to read one more of her biting political texts again. So I went for a while here and there, until her personality became clearer and more three-dimensional, ever richer, and hence more contradictory. As a consequence of my firmer and more multifaceted image of her, the next wave of anxiety came to me. How could I reproduce this range, this wealth of her personality in a film of only 2 hours? Finally, my admiration prevailed. How she defies and angered the social democrats time and time again. How she fought against and addressed this phalanx of self-satisfied men. And her confidence moved me. I, as one born later, who knew already what kinds of horrors the 20th century held in store, was touched by her belief that all would, despite the unfavorable times, turn out for the best. From prison, she comforted her friends and advised them to believe in history, which was so much wiser than people. After 2 years of research, I began to trust in her and in my image of her. In many respects, I recognized my life and hers. Toute proportion gardée, of course. I too often had to put up a fight against male prejudices and disparaging remarks. In Rosa's case, there was the added dimension that she was Jewish, and many in society at that time were anti-Semitic. There are caricatures of her that would lead to an outcry today. And so often she was dismissed even by her own comrades as a hysterical woman. Today we are familiar with this accusation of hysteria that is so often lodged against women who are smart and who attempt to assert their ideas. Perhaps you are not sure. Rosa Luxemburg, however, was not a feminist, and neither was Hannah Arendt. Both were exceptional individuals, and as such did not feel a need to champion other women. Yet, viewed from today, they fulfill everything that feminists want for and for women. But in the end, it was ultimately something else, something beyond their exemplary powers that drew me to them. Both of them, who, when considered from the outside perspectives, were such exceptionally strong women, were nevertheless acquainted with loneliness, with sadness, with betrayals of love, in love with pain. This hidden dimension of theirs, one could call it their second phase, allowed a feeling of closeness to arise. The following is a letter of Rosa's from prison, addressed to Sonja Liebknecht, the wife of Karl Liebknecht, her comrade in arms. Sonjitschka, I have lived through something sharply, terribly painful here. A few days ago, a wagon arrived at the courthouse where I take my walks. The load was still so high that the buffaloes couldn't pull the wagon over the threshold at the entrance gate. The soldier accompanying the wagon, a brutal fellow, began flailing at the animals so fiercely with the blunt end of his whip handle that one of them was bleeding. During the unloading, all the animals stood there still, quite still, exhausted. And the one that was bleeding kept staring into the empty space in front of him with an expression of his black face and his soft black eyes like an abused child. I stood before it, and the beast looked at me. Tears were running down my face. They were his tears. No one could flinch more painfully on behalf of a beloved brother than I flinched in my helplessness over this mute suffering. Oh, my poor buffalo, my poor beloved brother. We both stand here so powerless and mute, and are as one in our pain, impotence, and yearning. Sonichka, dearest, in spite of everything, be calm and cheerful. Life is like that. One must take it as it is, and remain brave, undaunted, and smiling in spite of everything. The first time I read this letter, I knew it belonged in my film. With it, I could contradict the image of the bloody red Rosa, in which so many people still believed. And in the 70s, there was a stamp with a portrait of Rosa Luxemburg, and there was actually people who declined to receive a letter if its postage was paid with this stamp. I have already mentioned, so that it's unimaginable, no? That you refuse to take a letter only because it's a portrait of her on it. No? So I have already mentioned that letters are extremely important for me as I figure out how to portray a person. That was certainly true when I came to my film about Hildegard von Bingen. It was in some respects even more difficult to get closer to her because the time in which she lived seemed so very distant, a time in which one still believed that the world was flat. On the other hand, I felt more free, and for the same reason. When we think of the beginning of the last century, we still sense a certain sort of relation. There are photos and even moving images, but not so with the Middle Ages. Hildegard was born in 1098 and died in 1179. She lived to be 81 years old, which was very unusual for her time. Nun, visionary, abbess, healer, researcher, composer, believer. I am neither a nun, nor a scientist, nor a composer. I was raised Protestant. What then could lead me to her? Only my curiosity and my many questions. The most important question for me was, what could this distant time offer a smart and gifted woman in our current sense? Did she have a chance to recognize her talent? And in what way was she able to realize it? The woman at the beginning of the so-called new women's movement in the 70s searched for role models from history. Were there any at all? Women usually appear in history books only if they were rulers like Elizabeth of England or Catherine the Great of Russia. Otherwise, world history was made by and described by men. These men had, of course, mothers, nurses, governesses, cooks, lovers, or wives, about whom obviously not a word could be wasted. Unless, of course, they had a mistress like Madame de Pompadour, with a certain political authority. I begin the film showing a group of people at the end of the first millennium who believed that the world would end during the night. They prepared themselves with asceticism and prayers, just as afraid as we were at the start of the 2000s because we expected the crash of the computer world. I imagined how unbelievable it must have been for these people when the sun came up again in the next morning. The world still existed, and they were still alive. The sun, the light, the night was over, and a new era had begun. And in the first century of this new time, Hildegard was born, and she received messages from this living light. In my film, I show the young Hildegard approaching. At first, the image is clouded and out of focus. and she slowly becomes clearly visible to the audience. For me, this symbolizes that audience relationship to Hildegard. She comes to us from the distant past, but we still ultimately see and understand her from the perspective of our modern secular knowledge. My research began with a visit to the Hildegard Abbey in Eibing, near Frankfurt. There I met Sister Philippa, who, as a former journalist, is responsible for contact between the Abbey and the outside world. She readily gave me the information, just as Annelies Laschitzer had done with Rosa Luxemburg. She told me which biography I should read, the one, for instance, by Barbara Boyce, Denn ich bin krank vor Liebe. Unfortunately, there's a great deal of nonsense and kitsch that's been written about Hildegard. And for that reason, Sister Philippa strongly recommended that I also read Hildegard's correspondence. Sister Philippa's only demand was, please, not too much herbs. Don't turn her in a fairy tale character. As you might know, Hildegard is most known today, almost in Germany, for her knowledge of herbs. There are pharmacies named after her, as well as cereals, teas, and a variety of cures. But of course, I had no intention of reducing Hildegard's legacy to her herbals. At the end of my first meeting with Sister Philippa, she invited me to observe a young nun taking her final vows. This was to take place in the Abbey 2 weeks later. It was quite an opportunity for me, as there are hardly any women left who want to become nuns. I was then able to speak with the nun taking her vows, as well as with her father, who had come to her initiation celebration. Her father was a craftsman who did not conceal his objections to his daughter's decision. I was therefore doubly impressed by this young woman and her sincere happiness about being able to take the way. In the Middle Ages, it was not unusual to enter a convent. When Hildegard was a very young girl, she was bequeathed to the church as payment of the so-called tenth, as a 10th child. She didn't have the right to object, and her entry into the convent was not a voluntary one. How does a person conduct herself when she is born into a time that we would not have chosen, and into a society that forces her to behave in accordance to its rules? Will she attempt, as Hannah Arendt turned it, to think without banister? Hildegard's banisters were Christianity, the Bible, the Psalms, the Word of God. How did she manage to recognize her strengths and her own desires within these clearly defined borders? How did she manage to realize them? She had visions and was convinced that they were sent her from God. But she initially wasn't sure if she was allowed to speak about them. She feared that some might believe the visions came from the devil, which would be meant excommunication. For a person of faith, that would be like receiving their version of the death penalty, that is, in eternal damnation. Today, we know that Oliver Sacks had written very impressively about it, that hallucinations can be triggered by especially severe migraines. Since Hildegard suffered from poor health for her whole life, and she repeatedly had to stay in bed for weeks at a time, one could easily assume she also suffered from this malady. After she had documented her visions in writing, she wrote to Bernard von Clairvaux in all humility. He was the most powerful religious figure of his time. She asked him to submit her visions to the Pope, for his official approval. That was, to put it crudely, her first coup. Hildegard succeeded in getting the church to recognize her as a visionary. But that she was no longer obliged to submit to her abbot. Next, the voice commanded her to found her own convent, and thus to abandon the convent in which she should have remained until her death. She switched from a double monastery, where both monks and nuns reside, to a convent for women only, in which she, according to the Benedictine rule, was the only authority. What fascinated me about Hildegard was how a smart woman managed to battle the confining rules of her time, today we would say to emancipate herself, and at the same time persevere in her belief that she only obeyed God's voice. She didn't comprehend that it was the voice of her own unconscious and of her secret wishes. As a result, she maintained her belief that women were weak. She emphasized again and again, "I'm only a weak woman." As with my research about Rosa Luxemburg, I was intrigued by the contradictions of Hildegard von Bingen's biography. On the one hand, as an abbess and a visionary, Hildegard corresponded with the powerful people of her time, with emperors and popes, whom she even admonished and to whom she gave orders. Orders, she was certain that they came not from her, but from God. On the other hand, when a young nun, Margarethe von Trotta, whom she had particularly taken into her heart, wanted to leave her in order to become an abbess of another convent, Hildegard was transformed into an ordinary woman, a woman whose passion and pain forced her to surrender her mighty powers of reason and to succumb to her irrational rage. In order to bring Ricardus back to her convent, and more importantly to herself, Hildegard went so far to write to the Pope, who ignored her request. Hildegard had to submit to her fate. To that end, I will read an excerpt from a letter that Hildegard wrote to Ricardus of Stade. "Woe is me, mother, woe is me, daughter. Why have you forsaken me like an orphan? I so loved the nobility of your character, your wisdom, your chastity, your spirit, and indeed every aspect of your life, that many people have said to me, 'What are you doing?' Now let all who have grief like mine mourn with me. All who in love of God have had such great love in their hearts and minds for a person, as I had for you, but who was snatched away from them in an instant, as you were from me. But all the same, may the angel of God go before you, may the Son of God protect you, and may his mother watch over you. Be mindful of your poor, desolate Mother Hildegard, so that your luck may not fade away. That your luck may not fade away. That sounds like a hidden threat, which can also be sought as a vision. Ricardus died just after 1 year after leaving Hildegard's abbey, and one can't avoid the suggestion that perhaps Hildegard, in some corner of her heart, wished death upon her, just as today's women sometimes do when they were abandoned by their lovers. And now to Hannah Arendt. I know that you're perhaps not d'accord with me about this interpretation. No, I must say here, you're in a religious surroundings, so I have to be a bit too worldly. When, after my initial resistance, I decided to try and make a film about Arendt's life and work, I first listened to her famous television interview, Zur Person, with Günter Gauss. At first, I only heard it as a sound recording. She sounded like an arrogant know-it-all, always interrupting and correcting the interview. I immediately wondered if I should give up on the project, even before having properly started. Shortly thereafter, I watched the same interview on DVD, and I was surprised at how being able to see her completely changed my impression. She was charming and enchanting, and I could understand Gauss when, upon being asked who his favorite interview partner was, he answered Hannah Arendt. He added that both he and his wife fell completely in love with her. Nevertheless, I did not fall in love with her for quite a while longer. Günter Gauss, the interviewer, told another surprising and revealing story. Hannah Arendt was, he said, so nervous before and during the videotape interview that he was afraid she might get up and leave the studio. Thank God, one of the cameramen suddenly interrupted and said that he couldn't record anymore. In '63, the cameras were still giant apparatus, and that could only be moved with great effort. And as it turned out, the wheels of the camera platform kept getting caught on a nail that was sticking up out in the floor. After several passes back and forth, he couldn't bear it any longer. So Gauss and Hannah thus went back into the dressing room, smoked several cigarettes, chatted together, and then went back onto the set after the problem with the nail had been resolved. And from then on, Hannah was calm, no longer nervous at all. We have this one errant nail to thank for this wonderful. Later on, in New York, Hannah Arendt's last assistant, Jerome Cohen, told me that Hannah was stricken by stage fright every time she gave a lecture or a reading. I had thought of her as fearless, and certainly was fearless in her way of looking at the world and analyzing it. To be afraid of people in front of whom one must speak publicly, that was familiar for me. And then I set off on my way, just as I had done with Rosa Luxemburg and Hildegard von Bingen. This time, all the way to New York. During my first trip, I asked Pam Katz, my co-author from Rosenstraße, if she could imagine a film about Hannah Arendt. I was actually prepared for a negative reaction, as my own had been at first, but no, Pam was immediately enthusiastic, and she began to work on it immediately. Pam is Jewish and a New Yorker, so she had two essential points of connection. The next day, we drove to 370 Riverside Drive, the building in which Hannah Arendt had last lived with her husband. I was already familiar with this area, as Uwe Jonsen, whose Jahrestage I filmed in 1999, had lived nearby. Jonsen had been friends with Hannah Arendt, and there's even correspondence between them. We photographed the house and the entrance to the lobby, an important first step. I need this kind of concrete image. I envisioned Hannah coming in and out of there. Nevertheless, I could hardly believe that Pam, without further hesitation, was eager to attempt a confrontation with Hannah Arendt. That she, unlike me, didn't need to go through a forest of concerns. I was thus suddenly caught between two people who urged me to enter this venture. But neither of them is a director. The imaginations are not pushed to create a living, moving image from a text. This is an enormous difference. Writing may be not easy, but as long as images persevere in the mind, anything is possible and conceivable. The work of the director begins in the moment one transforms images from one's fantasy into visible ones. and exactly at that moment the torture begins. To take one example, I had recklessly and tersely written in my script for Mary and Julia, Die bleiben Zeit, they scaled Mount Etna, a harmless sounding sentence. But then the entire crew, plus the actress, had to fight their way up the mountain. For me it was especially difficult because I was still a strong smoker, and at that time the stench of sulfur was so strong that I could hardly breathe. Finally our gaffer had to push me up the mountain, just a bit humiliating for a director. At that time I had to curse that one sentence in the script. But most of the time there are many more than just one difficult translation from page to a screen, and also describes a certain mood or atmosphere, let's say between night and day, or in the twilight of emotions, or in a particular landscape. And then you are standing on the set, and this mood refuses to appear. Time is the essence, and the producer is pressuring you because every day of filming costs a lot of money. On such days, one is often forced to accept compromises. Hannah Arendt. It's easy to write, she's a thinker, or she thinks. But how does one authentically describe that in a film? What was she really? To that end, William Korn, her assistant, writes, she is usually called the philosopher, and often described as a political and moral philosopher. But I wonder, was Socrates a philosopher? He was a thinker, to be sure, and a lover of wisdom, which is what philosophia means in Greek. But do we know what wisdom is? We should not forget that Socrates insisted he knew nothing. Might that have been the reason that Delphic oracle proclaimed him the wisest of all men? Hannah Arendt was a thinker with a need to understand. She said she could not live without trying to understand whatever happened. And the times she lived through were replete with events, many of them unprecedented, each of them difficult to understand in itself and more difficult to understand collectively. Catastrophic events, one after the other, cascading like a Niagara fall of history, as Hannah Arendt put it. Since the history of the 20th century, and with that the life story of Hannah Arendt, was packed with events that cascaded like Niagara Falls, where should we begin the description of her life? With her childhood in Königsberg, with her entrance into the seminar given by Martin Heidegger, the master of thinking, as Hannah Arendt later characterized him, with her escape from Germany in '33 through Prague to France, and her exile in Paris, where she encountered Walter Benjamin and Heinrich Blücher, the men who became her husband. With the German invasion of France and Hannah's time in an internment camp, with her escape from there to Marseille, and from Marseille to Lisbon to New York. You are perhaps familiar with the magnificent film trilogy by Axel Corti, written by Georg Stefan Troller, Welcome to Vienna, in which is recounted the fate of Viennese Jews who fled from France to the United States and who initially had to live in bitter poverty. Hannah Arendt and Heinrich Blücher too had no money and could not speak a word of English. Hannah Arendt had to work like a young girl as an au pair in a middle-class American family in order to learn the language. It was 41, and she was already 35 years old. Every single of these excerpts from her life could have made for an exciting dramatic film. What then should we have chosen? We were immediately certain that we did not want to write a love story a la Hannah and Martin. even if it certainly would have found funding for this concept more quickly of all. But we were convinced, among other issues, that her husband, Heinrich Blücher, was a more important man in her life. Then I learned that Lotte Köhler, a colleague and friend of Hannah Arendt, was still alive and living in New York. She received me cordially, but also skeptically. She could not imagine that a film could do justice to her friend, and she had recently had an unpleasant experience with a writer to whom she had, years earlier, entrusted as yet unpublished letters from Martin Heidegger to Hannah Arendt. This resulted in a kitschy theatrical play that had truly offended her. So Lotte Köhler was on guard with me. Not until after she had seen my film Rosa Luxemburg did she become more receptive. And she told me that Hannah Arendt had admired Rosa Luxemburg and had even written an essay about her. We heard many stories from Lotte Köhler then that we could not have found it in any of the biographies. Lotte Köhler also introduced us to Elisabeth Young-Brühl, Hannah Arendt's first biographer, who had also studied with her. In the meantime, she had become a psychoanalyst, which, as she said, would not have pleased Hannah. She too helped us move forward, precisely because of her psychoanalytic perspective. She described Hannah's fixation on older men, for example, Heidegger, Jaspers, Blumenfeld, as a search for her father who had passed away so early. Our principal contact, however, was Jerome Cohen, and he remains our most important source to this day. Soon these three people, Lotte, Elisabeth, and Jerome, became as important and intimate to us as the tribe has been for Hannah Arendt. Every time I came to New York, we met for dinner and felt a little bit like loving conspirators. The last member of the tribe was the widow of Hans Jonas, Lore Jonas, whom we met in a retirement home in Philadelphia. She gave us a letter of her husband, which has never been published, in which Hans Jonas rescinds his friendship with Hannah after he reads her article in the New Yorker. By this time, 4 years had gone by. We had read almost all of Hannah's books and writings, but were still undecided about which period of her life we should choose and with which theme we should begin. Finally, we found the key to portraying Hannah's life and work. We would concentrate on the Eichmann years. Hannah Arendt travels to Jerusalem on assignment from the New Yorker and takes part in the trial against Adolf Eichmann. With this, I had a true antagonist for her, a human of flesh and blood who sat in the glass box. He was not some abstract idea, but instead a man whom we could observe along with her, and we would then be able to begin to understand her thinking. Hannah Arendt and Adolf Eichmann were both born in Germany in the same year, 1906. But what different life stories. An ambitious National Socialist climber and bureaucrat, and a Jewish intellectual who had to leave Germany. The philosopher and the man who voluntarily surrendered his ability to think in order to obey the Führer. Not until we found this solution to our problem of the script did my fear gradually disappear, replaced by a cautious confidence. After that, it very quickly became clear to me that in order to portray this encounter between two worlds in a believable way, I would have to use authentic black and white footage from Eichmann's trial. Years before I knew that I would be asked to make a film about Hannah Arendt, I had seen a documentary film, The Specialist, by Egan Sivan, which was solely about Eichmann's trial. I wanted to be sure that I could use this footage. In the meantime, we had found a producer, Bettina Bocampbell, who was passionate about making the film. She approached Yad Vashem and managed to gain the permission for us to use the excerpts we needed. As was the case before with Rosa Luxemburg and Hildegard von Bingen, letters were essential to gaining an understanding of Arendt's political and private self. There was correspondence with Karl Jaspers, who, by the way, was initially supposed to be a character in my film, with Mary McCarthy, her American friend, and with Heidegger. In the case of Heidegger, unfortunately, almost all of the remaining letters were his. Hannah Arendt had carefully collected them and stored them in her bedside drawer, while it seemed that he had disposed of hers. Either they were not important enough for him, or he was afraid of his wife's jealousy. There are also published correspondences with Kurt Blumenfeld, with Hermann Brock, with Gerd Scholler, and with many others whose letter we were able to consult in the archive of the New School, where Hannah Arendt had also taught. Since a person, and especially a woman like Hannah Arendt, shows a different side of her character to each of her many friends and colleagues, such the kaleidoscope was the best way to create an image of a complex individual. As I read her many letters, Hannah increasingly became a friend to me. And Lotte Köhler said to me she was just a genius of friendship. In conclusion, I would like to read an excerpt of a letter of hers that confirms the statement. It's an answer to a letter from Gerd Scholler, who accused her of not loving the Jewish people. How right you are that I have such love, and for two reasons. First, I have never in my life loved some nation or collective, not the German, French, or American nation, or the working class, or whatever else might exist. The fact is that I love only my friends, and I'm quite incapable of any other sort of love. I could say that for myself.
What a wonderful, touching quotation.
With my poor English and all my faults in English, I must apologize.
Not in the least. So it is our custom to take questions first from students, and so I'm hoping that someone will be so bold as to take advantage of this opportunity. I might even have to call on somebody. You should try to save each other by somebody.
I would say let's call us a day.
They have a lot of questions. I'll take any other questions from the audience. Yes.
I have a question about Hannah Arendt's famous phrase, the banality of evil. As a short version of a description of Eichmann's moral status. On the one hand, heavily criticized in the Jewish community as totally misrepresenting what was going on. On the other hand, within your film, from beginning to end, a totally reasonable assessment as one watches the story unfold. So I'm wondering to what extent, subconsciously or consciously, you were motivated by trying to make her assessment look reasonable.
saw the whole material of the Eichmann trial. And I saw this man in his glass boot, and I saw how he reacted and for so many people in America, I think perhaps they didn't understand enough German to feel how his language was. It was only the bureaucratic, and with the language already, you could feel that he couldn't think. And for me, when I saw it, and I have it in the film, it was a test or the proof that he couldn't really think, or he gave up his capacity to another person, like the Führer, when he is asked in German from the German Jewish judge, if there would have been more, wenn there mehr Zivilcourage gewesen wäre, wäre dann alles anders gewesen. If there would have been more moral courage, would have that changed the, no? And Eichmann says, oh yes, that would be different if the moral courage would be organized already. And he even does that. And that was for me the moment I said, she's right. He's unable to, no? To confront moral courage with hierarchy. So that is really distorted. No?
I wonder about how you as a filmmaker work with the inner musical imagination of a figure in your biography who is a composer. And if you think, or how you work with the music and what's heard as the film unfolds.
The composing of the music in the film,
or with the musical
music of the person itself.
As I mean, with the musical imagination as a part of the biography of the life of a human being.
That's a difficult question because it's so personal. When I wrote the script and when I did the film about Rosa Luxemburg, for instance, I heard all the time the Requiem of Verdi. So that was for me her music. So for every film I have a sort of music which is from me, but it has perhaps nothing to do with the person I'm portraying. It's only my feeling and my getting into the mood for love, as I told.
But it becomes an important part of the character in any case. Yeah. Thank you.
Rosa Luxemburg and Hannah Arendt, in different ways, were both active in politics. But in presenting the biographies, you emphasized the personal. And I wondered whether their political activity was accidental from your point of view, or if that's an important element of the films.
Understand.
She's saying that they were very active in politics.
Yes.
But since you emphasize in your films so much the personal lives of these people.
Yeah, but I did the conviction of somebody is also to connect it to the character. I know that, as I said it also before, that leftist historians, they never admitted that somebody has also a personal life. It's just political life, and you are judged by your political understanding or acts or so. And for me, it's not that. It's the person is the two, your personal life, and you can have a very difficult life and being a very optimistic political figure like she was. She was really always hoping and always giving courage to the others, but she was a person which suffered also a lot. So this side, for me, it's human, and I can't accept politics without this human side.
Well, I wondered the other way around, if the politics were an important part of your selection of these individuals.
For me, it was important to show also, like she hoped until the end, and she was always still believing in her utopia, and then she was murdered by people or by soldiers who then became soldiers of Hitler. So for me, as a Jew, she was the first victim of the Nazis. Yeah? And I show it, and for me, it's important to show it also by images when she goes down in the hotel, but then she's murdered outside. She goes down a tapestry, a red, long way down on this red tapestry. And that is for me a symbol of the bloodstream, which is already announcing this century. And so on. So I try always to give images. For us, they have another meaning than in the moment the film is here. For instance, the other in Rosa Luxemburg, the moment of the switching of the century to the 19th century. No, there is a party, let's say, for the social democratic party members, and they are all in costumes, and she has a costume of a geisha because she was very little, and so. And August Bebel, who in this time was the leader of the socialistic party, he speaks about the last century, which was a hope, and this century coming up now, which that will be the realization of that hope. You know? And then behind him, there's a big sort of poster, but made by flowers, very red flowers. And these red flowers are the symbol of the party, no? Still nowadays. And in this big red, it's written white 1900. So the innocent number with the blood behind. And it's in his back, and he's not even seeing it. He speaks about the realization of hope, and we see this bloody thing coming up behind him. So that's already a sign for what will happen, and that his utopia will not be realized. So this is the sort of filmmaking. You can show things that are not spoken of. And for me, this is the important moment in films.
Well, I'm going to start with the student first.
So you've mentioned several times fascination with and a temptation towards tackling contradictions or seeming contradictions, whether you the character.
Please louder. I'm a little bit deaf.
So you've mentioned a temptation towards tackling contradictions, whether that be with the characters or with people's perceptions, and it would seem to be an apparent contradiction with having a real strong directorial vision and tackling biography. So my question is, have there ever been any instances where you found that to be true?
If I had some intuition that could be true.
I didn't follow the question, so somebody will need to track. It sounded very interesting.
Gibt es eine Spannung zwischen die Tatsachen der Biografie und die Kontradiktion? Sie müssen die Wahrheit folgen, aber ist das eine Art von Hemmnis? I don't know if I understood you.
Okay. Now I follow the truth, and but sometimes you have to intuit the truth. You don't get everything from material you find, and sometimes you have to complete it with your own intuition. But I'm never going consciously against the truth or against historical facts. I just try to complete it with my emotion or with my inner knowing.
So we have time for two more questions. Okay, you said you had 3 more questions. Here.
Okay, I'm first, okay, in this kind of group. Well, I really appreciated, Hannah Arendt, because you put this intellect, which we sort of like see as a Hannah Arendt. Yes, we think Hannah Arendt, and then we see this great intellect. Well, you put this intellect into a female's body. Yeah? So one of the things which I really appreciated in your film was that how you and Barbara Sokoła presented Hannah Arendt, dressed up in a very feminine way, very feminine.
She was always a target. Yeah, and she was against that women are like me. She was very, very old-fashioned.
Yeah, but also very affectionate with her husband, yes, but not only. But I was thinking about one thing. You said that, you paired her with Eichmann, yes, and then there is this very important element in your take on her biography when she's saying that she tries to understand Eichmann, but not to give apology, not to sort of forgive him. So this is a very important message.
That is
to understand, but not to forgive.
Yeah.
On the other side, when I was watching your representation of Hannah Arendt's interaction with Martin Heidegger, yes, I had the sense that she forgave him.
Yeah,
but
not really, but she.
That she understood why he did it. And so my question is, did you consciously decided not to go into this kind of path to try to make your character Hannah Arendt try to understand Martin Heidegger, a great love of her life?
No, for me Heidegger was not as important, perhaps, as he was really as a philosopher in the last century and also in her life. I put him in because she says in the end that thinking, so Eichmann didn't think, she's a thinker, and she said maybe that thinking can help us to avoid these terrible situations, not to step in. And Heidegger, who was a master of thinking, he followed Hitler, or he had for a certain time. So thinking is not helping you, perhaps, to save you. And that he was a sort of, had also, like Hannah Arendt has a utopia, Rosa Luxemburg a utopia of, of hope for the future. And she had also from the utopia that thinking could save you. But Heidegger was the example that thinking sometimes doesn't help you to step in the false direction. So therefore I put him in, and not because he was her lover.
I think I have more of a comment than really a question for you, and I just wanted to thank you also for these portrayals of thinking women. I'm an academic here at Notre Dame, and I deal with controversial and difficult issues, and I found it quite empowering how you look at women and see how they value their friendships, and how painful it really was to have to sacrifice friendships to stay clearly on follow the vision that they felt compelled to follow, to be true to themselves, to be true to the ideal of the intellectual life, to the integrity that they found and that they searched for. And I think that reality has been very, very helpful because you did portray this particular facet in such a personal and warm way. And I know that you yourself suffered criticism for the Hannah Arendt film,
Yes.
and yet you modeled in yourself, for me, and I think of course for so many others, that you remained committed in the way you described tonight, how you took so seriously and you did with integrity what you felt you had to do. So thank you for that. It's an ongoing, wonderful thing.
Thank you.
And you were our last. Yeah, I just had a question. You do a tremendous amount of research working your way into your understanding of the particular subject of the film. How do you prepare the actors in that regard? Are you giving them things to read, or they read?
Yes, oh
Yes.
yes, oh yes, oh yes.
And so what I'm interested in is sort of how much you're willing to have Are they reading exactly what you're reading? Are they reading slightly different things? Or they?
No, they read everything. I give them a list. Barbara Sukowa, she reads always everything. And for Rosa Luxemburg even, she found there's a speech about peace against war in the film. I had once, because she spoke a lot ago against the war, and I had another speech in my script. And one day she came up with this speech we have now in the film, and she said, "Look, I think it's a better speech." And I said, "Yeah, you're right. I didn't. Perhaps I haven't tried it, and we put her, or for Hildegard von Bingen, when Hildegard dictates this medicine thing about how a man makes love, no? What happens with these two bowls and and she describes it in a way that it's perfect, but it's a little bit crazy because and he, who is the writing friend of her, the monk, how she could get that, where she could get that, know how it works. And that was a text Barbara found in her reading. And she said, that must be in the film. So we put it in the film. So just to answer your question, that she is so intelligent and so perfect, and also for how she's preparing herself for Rosa Luxemburg. She had to live, and to speak with a Polish accent in German. In Hannah Arendt, she spoke this terrible German, also English with a German accent, Like all these intellectuals, they came, they could speak Greek and Latin and French, but no English. So they learned it in a very adult state already. So they had this terrible accent. Practically all the Germans came over had this accent. So she lives since 20 years in New York. She speaks a perfect English. So she had to learn to go back to this accent. And it's a little bit better than Hannah Arendt herself. Hannah Arendt, if she would have really imitated Hannah Arendt's exact accent, then it would be have a caricature. So I said, go down a little bit. We don't want to make a caricature for now. For spectators of nowadays, they are so used that everybody speaks English. So, and she, 3 months before we started the film, she started to speak like that. With her family, with her friends, they all get crazy because of this accent. But she did it, and so when we started to shoot, she did it already in a normal way. So that is her preparation. So she is the ideal actress for these sort of persons, because you can believe that she's intelligent, and I had German producer, but also from television and from other institutes of subsidies, and they said you can't take Barbara Sukowa for Hannah Arendt. She looks so different, and she is not Jewish, and so they want, and it's counterproductive. You can't always take her for all your films and so. And I said, okay, I don't do the film without her. And then they take in the end, when they saw the film, then they get to their knees and they were.
It's not well known, but Hannah Arendt used to come to Notre Dame a lot in the 1950s. She had very good friends here, particularly a guy named Valdemar Guria. It was a very interesting biography. And so it's appropriate that we're talking about her today. It's also appropriate because 2.5 years ago we had Barbara Sukowa with us, and Barbara, some of you met her, is fantastic, just the greatest actress. And so now it's really, really appropriate that we have you here. Hannah Hannah Arendt, but also Hildegard von Bingen, Rosa Luxemburg, and others' greatest biographer. And so we have a small
Yeah, what is it?
it's a little box.
It's a camera.
Oh, oh, nice.
It's a little medallion.
That is superb.
Yeah,
Yeah. I will take it.
yeah. Well, before I forget, we will be showing Margarethe von Trotta's film, Die Abhandene Welt.
Yeah.
And Abhandene is hard for me, but it means, I guess, the misplaced world.
Yeah, it's not a good translation, but
Yeah.
I didn't find a better one.
So we'll be showing your terrific new film, premiering it, starring Barbara Sukova, our friend, and tomorrow night at 7. And listening to you, Margarethe, I can't help but think that the next thing we must do is to bring you and Barbara together, absolutely, and do even more. So thank you so much.
Thank you.